Welcome, everyone. Thank you so much for being part of our conversation about the Religion Around series on Penn State University Press. And we have some of our esteemed authors with us. I'm delighted to be hosting. I'm Tracy Fessenden. I'm at Arizona State University. And my guests today are, I'll introduce them very briefly here, and then we'll hear a little bit more from them. Britt is the author of Religion Around Walter Benjamin. Joshua Eckhardt is the author of Religion Around John Donne. Stephanie Paulsell is the author of Religion Around Virginia Woolf. And we may be joined a bit later in the hour by Chad Seals, the author of Religion Around Bono, Evangelical, Enchantment, and Neoliberal Capitalism. So I'm going to ask each author to tell us just a little bit about their book, and then we'll open it up for discussion and we'll be taking your questions. If you have a question, you can submit it via the Q&A button at the bottom of your screen. And if the question is for a specific author, please note that, and we'll do our best to get to as many questions as we can. So I am going to just ask our authors in alphabetical order to share a little bit about their title with us. And we'll hear first from Britt. Brian is professor of religion and culture at Virginia Tech. In addition to Religion Around Walter Benjamin, Brian is the author of Post-Secular Benjamin, Agency and Tradition, Biblical Curses, and the Displacement of Tradition, and Walter Benjamin and the Bible. So Brian, thank you for starting us off.
Thank you, Tracy. Thanks to Kate, and it's great to be part of this. Thanks to all of you for coming. I'm going to share my screen and show some images to illustrate some of the points as I describe this project. So it might be the first time that these four thinkers and writers have been discussed in the same event: Walter Benjamin, John Donne, Virginia Woolf, and Bono. And I'm sure that we'll discover they have a lot in common. When I was asked to write this book, I was excited by the word around. If you know a little about Walter Benjamin, you know that a lot has been written about his dialogue with some religious thinkers, but there hasn't been much written about religion around him. And as I learned, as I looked into this, it became difficult to get answers to what was going around religiously for two reasons. One is that he didn't say very much about the religion around himself, except when he was traveling. And the other is that the scholarship about the early 20th century, particularly in Germany and Berlin, says very little about religion, especially institutional religion. So what I ended up doing to solve or address this challenge was to go to archives in Berlin and spend a lot of time trying to uncover some primary sources that would help me get answers to the question, what was going around religiously. And I also found myself engaging with a strand of religious studies scholarship called lived religion. So those were the sort of ways I thought about this problem of religion around. And getting into the topic, the first thing that my imagination did was to think about the city of Berlin, where I had visited a number of times, and particularly two buildings that sort of embodied from the Baroque period, the sort of balance of church and state moving from left to right. On the left is the Berliner Dome, and on the right is the Berlin Castle. It's now been reconstructed, but in German terms, it's actually in reverse. It's throne and altar, or Thron und Altar. So this balance and this relationship of the official state religion and the imperial government that really sort of shaped much of German history until the end of World War I, has a lot to do with the story of religion around Walter Benjamin, I think. And again, I'll be happy to say a lot more about it. At the same time, as we can certainly do a lot of learning about the institutional religion around him, there were lots and lots of experimental thinkers, esoteric thinkers, occult thinkers, and their contributions to the climate were far greater than the numbers of their groups would suggest. So here are two examples of books by thinkers whose work had a lot to do with some of the religiosity outside of institutional religion. And some of it, as you might suspect from if you are familiar with the way runes are even being used now, and in the swastika on the cover of the book on the left, some of it was also increasingly associated with nationalism. Likewise, in the case of the thinker on the right, Ludwig Klages, a radical thinker, an interesting thinker, his associations with Lebensphilosophie move in a lot of different directions, and increasingly also of great interest and appeal to nationalists. So what you start to see, or what I started to see in this kind of search for understanding of religion around Walter Benjamin, was that you had this relatively strong and established bond between church and state, but at the same time, a very fast declining rate of religious observance and a very fast growth in populations, particularly in the industrial cities of Hamburg and Berlin. So this kind of mix becomes quite volatile, quite polarizing. And as I thought about it then, I realized maybe this is one of the reasons why Benjamin is reluctant to talk about institutional religion around him, because it's so intricately connected to the kinds of nationalism that were already troubling him in the 19 teens and 20s. For German Jews who had experienced emancipation only recently in Germany, the story became particularly complicated. And I had the chance to learn about a lot of other German Jewish people from the time who were not only in Benjamin's educational and social class, but also even lived in the same part of West Berlin that he lived in. One of those people was the first foreign minister of Germany during the Weimar period, Walter Rathenau. He was assassinated by German nationalists in 1922. And the reason I show this photograph is that it shows an outpouring of opposition and protest against this act of violence. It takes place actually right near the Berliner Dome, which you can see on the right of this photograph. And in 1922, when this happened, the Chancellor of Germany was a Catholic from the majority Catholic Center Party, a guy named Joseph Wirth, who denounced the nationalists and the anti-Semitism that led to the murder of Walter Rathenau. I mention that because one of the interesting strands of the story is, along with all of this polarization between institutional Christianity, Protestant Christianity on the right, and secular and particularly socialist groups on the left, during this period, there was a party called the Center Party that really did play the role of sitting kind of in the center, and it was a majority Catholic party. At this time, that party stood pretty solidly with the opponents of violent nationalism. But by 1933, as you know, the tide had turned. Another fascinating author from this period, another German Jewish author from Benjamin's neighborhood of Grunewald, was Elsa Uri. She was an author of young children's books, of sort of chapter books, particularly for girls. She wrote over 39 books. She wrote 10 books in the series named after this girl, Nesthäkchen, the nestling. She's a Gentile girl who is a little kind of, for us, it might sort of suggest sort of Laura Ingalls Wilder books. And she was immensely popular. There were no mentions of Judaism at all in these novels, even though Elsa Uri started her career writing fiction that had Jewish themes in it and came from a religiously observant family. The book on the left was really kind of patriotic about, as most Germans were during World War I, patriotic about the war. That isn't too surprising. What might be a little more surprising is that the book on the right, 1933's Youth to the Fore, Youth to the Front, that book is also quite nationalistic. And it ends with a scene of a Nazi rally and the crowd cheering, the crowd getting very excited about the advent of this new period of German politics. Elsa Uri, despite her wealth and success and fame, was not able to escape being murdered herself 10 years later in Auschwitz. So again, another really interesting case, a much more popular writer then and now than Walter Benjamin, and a writer whose books are still serialized for television in Germany today. As you already know, there were lots of new things happening in the modern city of Berlin, and it wasn't just Benjamin, it was other people as well, friends of his, who wrote about the dramatic and interesting changes in the life of the city and the life of the modern person. Sigrid Krakauer, Joseph Roth, Franz Hessel were some of Benjamin's friends who like him, found something kind of religious about these phenomena. They wrote about the department store, the big department store, as a phenomenon with its spectacles, its sales, its events that drew a lot of customers, but also kind of shaped the retail and social life for many people in the city. The cinema was another important example of this. Again, Krakauer is famous for writing about the German cinema. These buildings illustrate, I think, some of the grandiosity and some of the ambition of those new institutions, and they also kind of capture what these authors, Benjamin and others, saw as a kind of religious quality to these new phenomena. So a lot of the book picks up something that religious studies had already started in the 19th century and runs with it, and that is to think about religion beyond the scope of institutional religion. And of course, that's something Benjamin is known for, and it's a lot of fun to work on. And I'll finish with this. I also found it fun to watch this silent film that Billy Wilder was involved with. He didn't direct it, but he probably wrote the story, called People on Sunday. And it's a very unusual film because it's sort of a slice of life without a lot of main characters, showing how people might have spent their leisure time on Sunday. It's striking, of course, because there's no religious observance at all in the film. A lot of it has to do with young people going swimming at the Wannsee. But it also includes, and this is a still from the film on the right, it includes a popular activity of the time that was also important to Benjamin, and that's going for walks in the park, particularly in the central park in Berlin called the Tiergarten, which has a whole series of monuments along a street or along a kind of path. So you see here an example of a Sunday stroller taking a look at one of the rather perhaps bombastic Prussian monuments in the Tiergarten. It's something that gets at a topic that Benjamin himself really explored deeply in what I would say is probably, if you haven't read anything by him, his most readable book. It's Berlin Childhood. It wasn't published during his lifetime, but it's a beautifully written account of a child's perspective with lots and lots of Christmas, even though he's from a Jewish family, a child's perspective of the sort of wonder and delights of this city that, when he wrote it, was already a place he could no longer go. So I think I'll finish with that and leave time for more discussion.
Thank you so much, Brian. I feel like we've just scratched the surface. So I'm grateful that the titles are all on sale for 40% off if, for all of those who are eager to read more. We'll hear next from Joshua Eckhardt. Joshua is Associate Professor of English at Virginia Commonwealth University, and he is the author of Religion Around John Donne.
Thank you very much, Tracy and Kate and everybody involved for this. My book came out a little while ago now. In fact, I'm no longer associate professor, full professor now. And so it's not, I'd hoped in publishing with a series that the book might last a little longer than academic books sometimes do. And it's great to be a part of this and to see that it's still a going concern. So thanks very much. My book is called Religion Around John Donne. John Donne was a very popular poet and pretty popular preacher in and around London under Elizabeth I, James VI and I, and Charles I. Some of his most famous writings might be lines that come from Devotions Upon Emergent Occasions, a book that he wrote when he thought he was dying, wasn't actually dying, he survived it. No man is an island entire of itself. Here, those words are used in an anti-Brexit protest. Every man is a piece of the continent, a part of the main. If a clod be washed away by the sea, Europe is the less. I don't quote those lines in my book, but I do quote these, which are closely related. All mankind is of one author and is one volume. When one man dies, one chapter is not torn out of the book, but translated into a better language. Every humanity amounts to a single book, and God is the one author of all mankind. And death doesn't remove anything from God's creation in this metaphor. It only translates it and improves it. And God employs several translators, you can see there. Age, sickness, war, justice. Now, a team that large would seem to generate a lot of loose paper. And indeed, his hand shall bind up all our scattered leaves again for that library where every book shall lie open to one another. Now here, this is just a metaphor. Donne is just using a library and books made of loose leaves as a metaphor for souls in heaven. And it's a beautiful image of heaven, a library where books somehow remain open to one another with some communication going on. My book does the exact opposite. It doesn't say anything doesn't say anything about religion it doesn't say anything about my beliefs about religion. It doesn't impose any beliefs on anybody else, but it does have an awful lot to say about actual library books. The copy what I'm doing here by quoting Devotions Upon Emergent Occasions is in one sense very, very common. You're looking at a PDF that comes from microfilm of a particular printed copy from the first edition of Donne's Devotion Upon Emergent Occasions. It came from Early English Books Online, which is an expensive database that most university folks can have free access to. And that is a digitization of EBE, Early English Books, a microfilm series. We typically use images like this to quote works of major authors. But of course, it's not a copy. This is not what you're seeing is also an image of a particular copy, a particular set of leaves bound together in a particular place. This one happens to be at the Huntington Library in San Marino, California. And it also happens to have this vellum cover with the letters FB stamped into it. Those initials in the front and back, those stand for Frances Bridgewater, Frances Edgerton, the first Countess of Bridgewater. And there's more that you can't see on EBO as well. Little numbers and letters like these. You might see R5 scratched out and then B521. What do they mean? Well, this is a different manuscript also at the Huntington that shows you, that decodes those references. T64. Those are the letters and numbers listed inside this fantastic manuscript of John Selden's Judicature in Parliament. And down below, you might be able to see that these refer to the Ashridge Library. That's the private library in the Edgerton's country estate. T refers to the cupboard that they're in. 6, the shelf. And this at one time was book 15, but now up top you can see it's been moved to 4. My first chapter and various points later on in the book, I read Donne's words in particular copies, and I look for the religion that is physically right around them. The religious poems that are around Donne's poems in the manuscript that very same woman, Frances Bridgewater, owned and had her initials stamped in gold on the front covers. This is the front page. You may not be able to see here, but all those lines are in gilt. Every leaf of this manuscript has gold leaf ruling the edges. My book is an exercise in not just reading Donne's works and looking for the religion the way I was taught in the social context or the historical context. It's an attempt to also account for the individual texts of those works and the unique material religious contexts that surround each of them. Religious poems around Donne's poems in particular individual volumes, religious books that people bound together with Donne's own religious books in Sammelbinde, omnibus volumes. The religious books in Donne's own library, we still have over 200 books that he owned and marked up. And then when I finally, I say I'm not working with works, I'm working with individual texts, but that's not true for the full book. By the end, I do deal with whole editions of Donne's books, but that's because I'm looking at the material religious context of individual London booksellers. So I reconstruct their shops and what books were on sale alongside Donne's. That chapter is also devoted to Donne's first biographer, Isaac Walton, and I started this little show with an image of Donne that's not only from Walton's biography of Donne, but it's also from the copy that he owned and that he inscribed and that's still available in Salisbury Cathedral Library. So the final chapter is partly about the booksellers who sold Donne originally and what they surrounded him with, but also about Walton's library and what he kept around Donne and gave to his children in his will, along with his book of Donne sermons. I think that's enough for me now.
Thank you, Joshua. And Professor Joshua Eckhardt, I'm very pleased that this book could be part of your promotion.
It was a big part of it. Big part of it, yeah.
That's wonderful. Thank you. Thank you so much. We'll hear next from Stephanie Paulsell. She is Susan Shawcross Schwartz, Professor of the Practice of Christian Studies at Harvard Divinity School and the author of Religion Around Virginia Woolf.
Thank you so much, Tracy. And to provide a transition from Donne to Woolf, Woolf thought that reading is what we'd be doing in heaven. That was her definition of heaven. It was like one long extended reading. So thank you for that. I'm very grateful to Penn State University Press for taking on this project, and so grateful to Peter Kaufman, who thought it up, and to Tracy Fessenden, who is our great general editor for the project. Every time I meet authors on this project, I can see that these are passion projects that we were so glad to be able to. Yes, there's Tracy's wonderful book on Billie Holiday and Peter's on Shakespeare. Wonderful books, very influential on me. But these are really projects that I think all of us have wanted to do, sometimes needed permission to do. And it's great to have this place to think about the religion around figures that have meant so much to us. I've known Brian Britt for more than 30 years. When we were students, he was working on Benjamin and I was trying to work on Woolf. And here we are, all these years later, still talking about them, which is pretty great. As a student, I read Woolf, I would say religiously, or at least obsessively. there was she always seemed to me to have some religious dimension to her work, although of course she's a very famous agnostic writer. There is, certainly and emphatically, there is no God, she wrote in her memoir. But it was in a way that I really didn't have the language to talk about. And I wanted to write a dissertation comparing her to a 14th century mystical writer named Marguerite Doint, who becomes a writer through her own writing as a mystical practice for her. And my advisor in the end wouldn't let me do it because he thought there were too many centuries to be crossed in that project. But I had all these questions always in my mind, and all these years later, and I'm so glad that this project, this wonderful series came along. Now, Woolf, of course, is one of the great forces in the development of literary modernism. And like a lot of modernists, she's trying to make more of life visible. She's particularly well known for making women's interior lives visible and human interior lives visible. And that's a really important part of her project. But she's also trying to make more of the world around us visible, including women's lives and friendship and politics and the way invisible social forces exert their pressure within our families and within our institutions. And also religion. Religion is part of that. It's part of the world she's trying to describe. Now, sometimes she does this in really explicit ways. She has some of the greatest, I think, church-going scenes in English literature, where you can follow someone from sheer boredom to exaltation and back down again in the matter of minutes. And, the great churches of London appear in various ways in her novels. But she's also trying to get at the way religious traditions move beneath the surface of ordinary life, like in dinner parties and in scenes of reading and scenes of dreaming. And I just have read Brian's book on Walter Benjamin, and he says, religion, to say we're going to study the religion around somebody, it's not quite as simple as it sounds. You can't just look around and see what's there and this is, of course, one of Walter Benjamin's great contributions to modern thought, is that all of these traditions have afterlives that aren't always visible. They aren't always explicitly lying there on the surface like a stone in the road. And that's certainly true of Woolf as well, and trying to get at the religion around Woolf. Some of that is, trying to hear what she heard, read what she read in the paper. She loved to read volumes of sermons by Christian ministers that she would find lying around in places where she went on vacation. She loved that. And because she was always trying to imagine her way into people's lives, all different kinds of lives. And so one of the ways to get at the religion around her is by looking at what explicitly is around her. But there's lots of hidden ways that the religion around her is manifest. And I'll just give you one example. In the 19th, her father and mother were both famous Victorian agnostics, both famously lost their faith and wrote about it quite a bit. And her father was a huge influence on generations of people, modern English people, for whom it was a great liberation to let go of the religion of their youth. He was a hero for them. And so she grew up in this household where there is no God was kind of a family motto. It would get inscribed in books when they were given as gifts and that kind of thing. But in the 19th century, Matthew Arnold, who was a contemporary of her father's, wrote an essay called The Study of Poetry, in which he says, religion just can't do the work it used to do for us. It can't interpret life for us. It can't console us. It can't sustain us anymore. So we need something else. And he said lyric poetry would be the thing we would need to turn to interpret and console and sustain us in our lives. 50 years later, Woolf wrote an essay called Poetry, Fiction, and the Future in 1927, kind of at the height of her, great works, Mrs. Dalloway and To the Lighthouse and Looking Toward the Waves, in which she says, lyric poetry can't do the work it used to do for us and for our ancestors. So we're going to need another form, something that's got the specificity of poetry, but the spaciousness of prose and its democratic reach. And she does say one thing about religion in that essay. She says, religion and science have between them destroyed belief. But she's not really talking so much about religion as she is about poetry's inability to speak to the modern crises. Lyric poetry. And but you can hear in there, you can almost even in the cadence of her sentences, you can hear Matthew Arnold saying, religion can't do the work it used to do for us. And so we need lyric poetry to do it. So, you know, she doesn't say, I'm trying to create a new religious practice, but you can hear it in what she wrote, that you can hear the loss of religion that her parents experienced. You can hear the desire to find in literature a way to access the things that religion let us access, to gesture toward an excess presence in life that eludes our attempts to express it, something she writes about a lot. To explore the life of the spirit, to make space for the work of grief and mourning, to cultivate new forms of shared community and devotional practice, to interpret life for us, to console and to sustain. So I was looking both for, you know, the institutional, visible parts of the religion around her, but also the hidden ways that the religion around her manifested itself in her work. That our books all have a very similar outline. We have 2 chapters that give a background, sort of historical background to what we're doing, and 3 chapters that dig more deeply into the works of our authors and artists. And I'll just briefly say what my chapters are. The first chapter is about family, her family, because she came from a very religiously restless family, who really, members of her family really defined a lot of the religion around her, the major currents in the religion around her, everything from her parents, you know, very well articulated, complex agnosticism, to her cousin Dorothea Stevens, missionizing evangelicalism that left her with a real distaste for proselytizing. Her Clapham sect ancestors, her grandparents, her great-grandparents, who were part of an evangelical Anglican sect that was very, that really wed religious life to social change, in particular, the struggle to eliminate slavery in England and in its colonies. She inherited a strong sense of vocation from those ancestors. She also felt like she inherited from them distrust of the body and its pleasures. So it was kind of a double-edged sword. So that first chapter examines the family influences on her, which are many. She also had an aunt who was a very important influence in her life, who was a Quaker theologian, and really, as the sort of Great Awakening type of evangelicalism swept also through England and began pulling Quakerism more toward doctrinal statements and away from its non-creedal roots. Caroline Amelia Stephen, Virginia Woolf's aunt, pulled it back in the other direction, and was a mystical writer, really advocated for what she called a rational mysticism. I think she was always trying to explain herself to her agnostic brother, and so tried to cast things as rationally as possible. But so in short, Woolf had a lot of religious influences in her family. The second chapter is about her friendships, her marriage, her travels, her engagement, especially with visual artists. Her sister was a great post-impressionist painter, as were many of her friends. And she spent a lot of time from youth onward looking at religious art and thinking about the relationship between what was happening, what she saw happening in those paintings, and the kind of beauty that she hoped to create in her own work. The last 3 chapters, the first one is about Woolf as a religious reader. This is where I got to go back to my mystical writer and the mystical reading practices of Lectio Divina and the creation of Florilegium from fragments of one's reading. These are all practices that Woolf seems to me to be involved in some way or another. Reading is the central, I would say, spiritual practice of her life. And like medieval mystical writers, there's a real fluidity between the practices of reading and writing. It's hard always to distinguish between them. The fourth chapter is on God and the way God, the presence and absence of God, sort of hovers in the minds of her characters, and in her own writing, her own diaries, her own writing about herself. And then the last chapter is about new forms of sacred community. She, of course, like Benjamin, lived during the rise of fascism in Europe. Like a lot of writers, she's trying to figure out where the world went wrong and what kind of community was needed to make a change. I compare her thinking about sacred community to T.S. Eliot's in this book. He, of course, thought that a new sort of European community would have to be grounded in a common faith. And Woolf really thought that human community needed to be grounded in the idea of a common life that we all share, and of which we're all a part. That chapter is a lot about her anti-fascist tract, Three Guineas, that she wrote in 1938, which is interestingly the book in which she may talk about religion the most explicitly. She talks about needing a new religion, maybe based on the New Testament, she says, but it's not going to look like what it looks like right now. Her critiques of religion in that book are not the kinds of critiques her father made, which her father's critique was religion is a dream, it's a fantasy, and we need to face reality. Her critiques were really religious critiques. They were theological critiques of religion not living up to its principles. I'll just end by saying I think her, in addition to reading, of course, writing is a life grounding practice for her. And at the end of her life, when she writes her farewell letter to her husband, one of the things she says is, I can't read and I can't write anymore. But she, I think for her, reading is a spiritual practice and writing is as well. And it's a practice in which she understands herself to be creating from fragments, like a lot of modernist writers. But she has a great line in To the Lighthouse, one of her great novels, in which the artist, Lily Briscoe, who's at the heart of that novel, is thinking to herself about the vocation of the artist. And she says, the vocation of the artist is to take things that seem not to belong together and put them together in a way that makes a globed, compacted thing over which thought lingers and love plays. And that's, I think, what Woolf is always doing, trying to create from fragments wholes that impel both our thought and our love. And I think, I end the book by saying, religare, religion, one of the potential origins of that word is to bind or to connect. And I think in her sort of binding and connecting and assembling and reassembling the fragments of her time, including the religion around her, she's really a religious thinker for her age and maybe for ours. So thanks very much.
Thank you so much, Stephanie. Thank you for that shout out to me and to our visionary founding editor, Peter Ivor Kaufman. I think you really identified that there's so much passion in these books, and I sort of had always attributed that to the iconic figures at the center who brought so much passion to their lives. But it's also the author's passion too, that we have a place to really lean into all that we are feeling for these figures. So thank you for being such a beautiful example of that. I also want to say that I share the general editorship with Chad Seals, our next speaker. He is Associate Professor of Religious Studies at UT Austin. In addition to Religion Around Bono, Evangelical, Enchantment, and Neoliberal Capitalism, Chad is the author of The Secular Spectacle, Performing Religion in a Southern Town. Chad.
Thanks, Tracy, and thanks for including me on the panel with Brian and Joshua and Stephanie. Thanks also to Kate for organizing this, and also Catherine Yonner, who recently departed from the Penn State Press, but was a major part of developing, I think, all these books and played a key role editorially with them. So just want to say thanks to her as well. I want to share my screen real quick and do just a run through of PowerPoint to give some background to the book and look forward to more conversation and questions. And originally, just as a note, I live in Austin, and Bono is in town on Thursday promoting his memoir. And Brene Brown, our esteemed local celebrity, lives up the road and has an affiliation with the business school at UT, is interviewing him about the book. And I didn't want to go to the event. It's at the Paramount Theater in Austin, and I feel obligated. So I thought I'd buy a ticket, which went on sale this morning at 10 a.m. And they randomly assort you into a lottery system to line up, and it was sold out in 10 minutes. So we live in opposite. Writing about celebrity makes you, no matter how successful we are as academics, it gives you a clear perspective on the limits of your reach as an academic. And I don't know if I'd ever want to write on a particular celebrity like Bono. And I blame Katie Lofton a little bit for setting the standard for writing on celebrities like Oprah. And Bono is actually really good buddies with Oprah and launches this campaign in America for the Red campaign, which I'll talk about in just a second. But the original cover of this book was a nice sort of clear, pristine image of Bono. And the thing that surprised me the most in the research about Bono was basically how 19th century he was in his views on race. And so I grew up in the panhandle of Florida as a white kid in a Southern Baptist church. And Bono was my easy way to rebel. I memorized his speech where he talks about apartheid in South Africa. I ended up going to Candler for 2 years at Emory and took a class with Desmond Tutu. And I was highly disappointed that Tutu didn't talk at all about the politics of South Africa, but instead only talked about theology of the rainbow people, which was interesting unto itself. But so Bono was this moment of sort of prophetic voice within conservative evangelicalism. When I went on to grad school at UNC, I took a class in globalization theory, and I realized like all this talk of world polity, like that is exactly what Bono's vision was for Africa and corporate intervention in Africa. And so that was the beginning of this project. And Peter, who was teaching at UNC at the time, recruited me for this, and I wouldn't have done this project without Peter. So really, this is as much his project as it is mine in some ways, and we had long conversations about it. Let me give you a quick run through of the argument of the book. One of the things I'll just focus on really quickly, just one aspect of the book is known as the Red campaign. It's not as popular as it used to be, but you may have run across it at some point. You may have run into a Starbucks and bought a red tumbler for your coffee, or the idea is corporations brand their products as red. A portion of those proceeds go to causes in Africa, particularly HIV, AIDS, antiretroviral drugs, or mosquito nets for malaria. And so Bono launches it with a series in Vanity Fair, or promotes it with a series in Vanity Fair. And one of the things in in Vanity Fair is the invocation of models in blackface. And Bono himself isn't in blackface, but invokes blackface. And one of the themes I discuss is his essentialization of racial difference and his romanticization of African musicality, particularly blues, and that is in the same tropes of blackface minstrelsy. And so that's one of the things. And so there's a way in which this book is extremely critical, but at the same time, a lot of conversations I have always begin with, how can you not like Bono? And I have to say, like, I'm still a fan of the music, for better or worse. But and I didn't kind of start the project wanting to just debunk Bono's celebrity, but it became fascinating unto itself that the history of Bono's views on Africa and Blackness fit the exact tropes of American racial difference, which in historical terms was ironic because particularly Irish Catholics, in which Bono has some connection to in Ireland, were abolitionists from the beginning. But when they come to the United States, the way to make it economically for Irish immigrants who aren't considered white in the 19th century is to perform blackface. Blackface begins in northern urban areas, not in the South. And so Bono actually follows the same trope and the same exact structural way in his invocations for work in Africa and his sort of Americanness of understanding of music. So he launches the Red campaign on the Oprah Winfrey show, and they go to a Gap in downtown Chicago to go shopping for Red products. Red products are branded in these ways, as you see here. And one of the things, there's a red, when the Red campaign first comes out, it's the invocation of the color red is a direct relationship to communism. So it's supposed to be socialist capitalism. And if you read this Red Manifesto, which is obviously a reference to the Communist Manifesto, you read at the very bottom that Red is not a charity, it's a business model. Basically, people buy the product then generates revenue that buys life-saving drugs for Africans. And it has this moral choice in which if you don't buy the pills, people die. And so we don't want them to die. So what do? You have to buy, if they don't get the pills, they die. So you got to buy the product and it's up to you. And finally, all you have to do is upgrade your choice. So one of the things, the way that evangelicalism meets up with Bono is the language of the heart. I read a clip of excerpt of his memoir, it opens up with heart surgery. So he's getting his chest cut wide open for heart surgery. And then he goes on from there. So evangelicalism being a language, a religion of the heart, how the heart is then corporatized, that any democratic, radical political force within evangelicalism is halted by the moving away from economic critique. This is what Dr. King has invoked by Bono, but never any stanzas on labor or any critiques of corporatism. So one of the things that happened early on in the Red campaign was there was, at its earliest years, a moral values calculator. You literally could put into a calculator the number of products you buy, and then you would get a result of how many lives you saved. It no longer has, it dropped the moral values calculator, the literal lives to product ratio, and instead replaced it with these this data of, if you buy Beats by Dr. Dre, you'll have given away 17 days of life-saving pills. So you see that it's not just a product, it's making the product morally good. And that's the evangelicalism, the evangelical enchantment of these neoliberal policies and practices. And again, to the language of the heart, this is a Hallmark ad. Bono is not the only performer to do this, but he constantly does the heart symbol and throws it out to the audience on stage. So Bono, I forgot to mention, I just assumed it's common knowledge, but Bono begins his sort of early days, converts to evangelicalism along with The Edge and Larry Mullen in Ireland. He speaks of being in a dislocated space in Ireland. And so it's growing up in a predominantly Catholic country, he finds evangelicalism, and then that becomes the basis for all that, plus his mother's death becomes the basis of all of his creativity. And so Bono is this force of generative thought and basically secularizing evangelicalism into neoliberal policies. One of my sort of favorite marketing ads that come out with the Red campaign is, it's not enough to be a good Samaritan, you have to be a good looking Samaritan. So it's the promotion of moral value with consumption, obviously. I mean, it's the most blatant and literal sense. And lastly, one of the things that fascinated me the most about this project was that all of the Red campaign is designed, and all of Bono's earlier work with Africa is designed to relieve debt in Africa. If you compare debt in Africa to debt in the United States, the sheer amount of debt in the United States is obviously it's much, much higher. However, the debt in Africa is deemed, because of all global economic models, to be a problem because of its ratio of GDP to debt. Americans see themselves as, through this model of consumption to help others, as this missionary enterprise, and buy goodness, literally buy salvation for others through credit. The very first Red product is the American Express credit card. So Americans are buying salvation for others through credit and racking up consumer debt. And so that, for me, the irony of the entire enterprise was this turning of missionary concern for elsewhere, obviously in Africa, and not for the very things that are happening in the so-called first world. So I'll end it there, and glad to talk more and glad to be part of this panel. So thanks for including me.
Thank you so much, Chad. Thank you, all of you, for reminding me why I love this series and what wonderful, wonderful books it has produced. We're going to take some questions now. We have some pre-submitted questions. We also have room in the Q&A if you'd like to submit a question for our panelists. If there's a particular panelist, please make sure to indicate that. We're going to go, it looks like, just a few minutes over the hour, so I want to make room for rich discussion, so we'll go just a little bit past the hour. Let me start with a question for Brian Britt. Stephanie mentioned that you've been working on Benjamin for 30 years, and we know that that has produced several other works, including two other manuscripts, two other volumes. What so now you're coming, or when you began this project, you came to think about religion around Benjamin. And so what, you know more about Benjamin than almost anyone else in the world. What surprised you? Were there new discoveries to be made? And how did this particular focus on religion around Benjamin bring those to light?
Yeah, thanks. The search for what was around him led to some surprises. So there were a lot of wonderful figures he never talked about, like Elsa Uri, or there was an activist priest named Karl Sonnenschein, who was a kind of a celebrity in the eastern part of Berlin with as an advocate for social justice among working class people. So some of the surprises were just, oh, there were all these people around, and there was all this interesting religious activity, institutional as well as other kinds of religiosity. That was one surprise. I was also surprised at the more nerdy level, how Benjamin was in, I felt like his work was in dialogue with this research on lived religion. So I found myself working on a different level with this kind of method of lived religion in dialogue with his engagement with what was then called the New Objectivity. If you're familiar with Berlin Alexanderplatz by Alfred Döblin, it was a novel that was an example of this sort of movement in the arts and thinking, and I found that to be an interesting surprise. Yeah, those are two of the main ones. I guess the third is, everyone knew, we all sort of knew that Benjamin was really interested in Christianity. It was deeper than I thought. I don't think it's because he was drawn to become a Christian, but I think it's because he longed for a kind of alternative Germany. So he had good friends who were Christian theologians, and he knew more about Karl Barth than he was willing to admit. And I think it's my hunch now is that he would sometimes tell them, "Oh, you're a really good German." These most of his friends were Jewish, but he had these kind of special German theologian Christian friends, and he would often really enter into deep dialogues with them. So that was another surprise.
Thank you. Joshua, I want to turn to you. You held up Peter Kaufman's great book, Religion Around Shakespeare. And since Shakespeare and Donne lived in the same city at the same time, what was your, how are those books different? Or what could you, what does your book do that Peter's book, Religion Around Shakespeare, doesn't do? If we're thinking about around in a literal sense environment, these are parallel environments or the same environment. So what's different about your work on Donne?
Yeah, I think it's a lot more different than it needed to be. And it has everything to do with what I tried to convey in my introduction. When I met Peter here in Richmond, when he was giving a draft, reading a draft, distributing a draft that we were discussing, for a draft of Religion Around Shakespeare. And it wasn't long after that that he asked me to write a book on Donne. And in some sense, if I did my work the same way that he does his work, then it would run the risk of redundancy. Of course, it would be different. He's a different person. I'm a different person. Donne's different than Shakespeare. Donne didn't work in the theater. He went to the theater. So there are differences. But I insisted from the beginning that the only way that I would do the project, and the only way that I could maintain my interest in it, is to take the title very literally. I didn't come up with the title for my book. I was given it, and I take it literally. I'm looking at the religion around Donne's poems, his printed books, in bookshops, in Sammelbände, in libraries. There is plenty of the abstract theological and the sociological and the historical. There's plenty of what the kind of information you get in Peter's book. There's plenty of the kind of broad national context that you get in many kinds of contextualization. But by taking this very, very narrow, nearsighted approach to that word around, I had to read all kinds of stuff I never, ever, ever would have been taught or would have put on a syllabus. All kinds of weird stuff is in these manuscripts. And I think the results in many cases are pretty predictable. You've got Catholics, you've got Puritans of one kind or another, you have conformist Church of England people, but the characters, the books are all different. And then even when something predictable does show up in my book, it's not just the author and the critic, not just me and Donne. There are scribes, printers, booksellers, buyers, owners, heirs of books, and when I know where the material is, and I can learn who made it and who preserved it, I'm a lot more interested.
Thank you. Okay, Stephanie, I'm going to try to recreate a situation I'm sure you've been in. I'm going to pretend we're just meeting for the first time. We're at a cocktail party in Cambridge, and you tell me that you've written a book called Religion Around Virginia Woolf. And I say, Virginia Woolf, religion. Well, is Virginia Woolf a religious writer? Isn't she a secular writer? Which is it? Okay, unmute.
Thank you. Yes, that has happened to me many times. When I first was working on this book, I had drinks with a really great scholar, Virginia Woolf, whose work I admire so much. And she said, "What are you working on?" And I said, "I'm going to write a book about Virginia Woolf and religion." And she went, "Oh." So there's a little discomfort there's a discomfort about writing about Woolf and religion, because she was not a religious person in the traditional sort of way. And she's really meaningful to a lot of people because of that. And I think, there's a worry that a book about religion and Woolf might turn her into a religious person, because she does have such a strong religious dimension to her writing that people have noticed over time and responded to. But I think, Brian felt that Benjamin does as well. I think Woolf really troubles the distinction between religious and secular. I think in 21st century America, we're used to thinking about religion as associated primarily with belief. And she also associated religion with belief. When she went to funerals and things, she would say, "I feel dulled and bothered by the problem of not believing." But she also was really close friends with the great historian of religion, Jane Ellen Harrison, who, said there's lots of religions where there's no God, where there's no belief in God is not the main thing. And so I think Woolf really opens up what it means to potentially be a religious thinker or someone who thinks with religion. She read the Bible. She thought she read it better than people who went to church and had it parceled out to them in little bits and pieces. She followed debates over women's ordination really closely. She talked about religion with her religious friends like T.S. Eliot and her non-religious friends about T.S. Eliot. She shows that there's many, many ways to engage with religion, and in ways that kind of makes that secular religious distinction less legible, I think.
Great. And I think this will be our last question. There are lots of ways that the religion and the secular get blurred, right? And one of them is in the extraordinary prose of Virginia Woolf, but another is in, Chad, something you talk about, which is cultural evangelicalism. So could you, you make that very much available to us in your work on Bono, but I think it's bigger even than Bono. So maybe you can tell us a little bit more about that term, what you mean by it, and why it's important for us to think about.
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, I'm trained in American religious history, and one of the standing traditions as the study of American evangelicalism is to really focus on churches as the medium of a revival tradition, as an influence on culture. So famously, Nathan Hatch said that the early revivals preceding the American Revolution were an incarnation of the church into popular culture. So everything, the distribution of religion in everyday life has, for the most part, scholars have really focused on the church. So the church becomes the medium. The thing that was popular the reason Bono was popular to evangelicals in the 80s and 90s, like myself growing up in that world, was he stood outside the church. He took the full stance of being prophetic and saying, I don't like the church, I don't want to worship in the church. He famously wouldn't take communion inside of a church. So, but at the same time, he went in front of a rock concert in a stadium and said, do you know everybody here? You know, this is church. So it was a way of like taking the church and like putting it somewhere else. So the cultural evangelicalism is really that the distribution of religion in everyday life. The church is to think of it as outside of culture as a theological move, and it's as embedded in culture as everything else. And so it's really the production of religious differences in those terms of secular and religious is a kind of is weighted with all kinds of theology. So that's kind of what I was after with the cultural evangelicalism piece. And I think it's brought in my current projects on industrial agriculture and American evangelicalism. And I think there's ways in which we haven't even sort of grappled with the power of evangelicalism beyond the sort of self-obvious political forms that are tied to churches. And the thing that I found, and one of the fascinating angles about the book was that a lot of people love U2 and say, I don't like church, I'm spiritual but not really. It's the whole spiritual but not religious crowd. And what I found is they are practicing in a cultural sense the same sort of ritual norms of moral superiority and sort of missionizing to the third world that evangelicals have promoted, for hundreds of years from the 19th century on. So that's what I was after. So thanks, Tracy.
Thank you. And we are out of time. I'm left with this remarkable image of books talking to one another in eternity. And I'm glad that we were able to perform that for an hour, put our books in conversation with one another. So thank you so much, Brian, Joshua, Stephanie, and Chad. Thank you, Peter Kaufman, for bringing us together, and everyone at the press, including Kate Frick and Catherine Yonner, who have helped to make this series a real thing. So attendees, thank you so much for coming. You will receive a follow-up email with links to all 4 of these books and a special code for a discount of 40%. If you'd like to find out more about the Religion Around series or about other of these virtual events, other books on Penn State, then you can follow the press on Twitter and Facebook. So thank you, everyone. This has just been delightful, and I'm so honored to be in your company today and as an author in the series. So thank you very much.
Thank you.